welcome to the next session of the Co-working Conference, the best co-working conference ever. So before starting, I want to appreciate to our sponsors that we are shooting from the Valley, the place at the Valley. So we just want to say thank you to them. We want to say thank you to Nexus, it's a co-working software. And we also want to thank you to Cobot, Iseo, and Craig. Cobot is also a co-working software. Iseo is a local company, and Craig is a co-working space in Barcelona. So today we have Sarah Colwell from Instant Group. We are going to talk about this disfuncional year. We have Mark. Please, Mark, come in.
Good morning. Yeah, we invited Sarah to talk about a dysfunctional year. 2020 has been at least challenging, and we invited Sarah to ask her about this year. Sarah is part of the research group at the Instant Group, and they analyze all the trends, and basically they have an overview about what's going on in different markets, and we ask them about the Spanish market, and they are going also to compare that with other markets. And yeah, let's go on. Let's see how Sarah and the Instant Group research group see what has been going around these months.
Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being there for us, and thanks for sharing your research. Thanks to the Instant Group. And please go on. I know you have a presentation, so you can share your screen. Please present yourself and then present your screen, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting the Instant Group to be part of this very exciting milestone conference. Over the next half an hour or so, I would like to share with you some of the unique insight and data that we've gathered during this past unprecedented year. My aim is going to be to provide some insight into the impact that the pandemic has had on the flexible workspace industry across Europe, with a bit of a deeper dive into what we're seeing within Spain. I'm not only going to touch upon the changes that we've seen in supply, demand, and pricing, but we're also going to look a little bit about how occupier needs and expectations are changing, and therefore what new workplace strategies are going to be evolving as a result of these changes. But before I jump detailed into the data, I'd like to just give you a very quick overview of who the Instant Group are and what we do. So we work with the largest number of flexible workspaces globally, which gives us quite a unique and unrivaled view of the market. We're therefore often one of the first to identify some new and emerging trends that we are seeing within the industry. And we can then use this knowledge to assist businesses with their real estate decision-making processes. Our clients range from large corporate companies all the way through to individuals and startups. And also more recently, we've been helping a lot of flex operators who are looking to expand into new or existing markets, all the way through to conventional landlords and retail property owners who are also looking to incorporate more flex into their leasing offering to capitalize on this growing trend that we're seeing towards flex within the real estate market. One of the key questions that we need to understand as a business fair to help clients is why change and why now? I think the why now is quite obvious recently. It's due to the ramifications of the pandemic. This global work from home experiment that we've had over the past year has put the spotlight very much on real estate for the first time. And people are asking how necessary that really is. We've procured and run offices in the same way for around 100 years, but this has now suddenly all been thrown into question. The world is changing, and therefore so inevitably is the way that we work. So why change? Well, I think now more than ever before, businesses are asking more from their workspace. They need it to reflect the needs of the people who are using it, and they need it to actually be able to evolve as their business changing, which has very much come under light in this past year. And we at the Instant Group are perfectly positioned to help these businesses to reevaluate their real estate portfolios and to ensure that it matches the needs of their business. So the importance of agility within corporate real estate has been heightened over the past 12 months. I think being able to right size and right purpose the office according to changing needs of the workforce and of their business has become very much a top priority for business heads. The occupiers are now wanting much more from their workspace. It's no longer just a place to go to work. I think the pandemic has shown that anywhere can become a workspace. We've all worked from the bedroom, the kitchen table, the local coffee shop over the past year. Instead, what they want from their office is increased agility, cost certainty, or even cost savings, reduced risk. And lastly, a topic which I'm going to touch on a little bit later on is diversity of location to offer their staff more choice in where they work. So in summary, what we are seeing is a general trend towards a service-based model. And this has been evident across many industries for a long time. For example, Drover allow people to rent cars on an all-inclusive basis, and Rolls-Royce have offered aeroplane engines by the mile for a long time now. But what is becoming more apparent is that it's the flexible workspace industry that is very much service driven by its very nature. And it's that industry which can actually adapt very quickly to change and can in fact provide the solution that many businesses need to a lot of the challenges that they faced over this past year. Which leads us on just first to take a quick look at what the impact of the pandemic has been on the flexible workspace industry across Europe. And I'm going to look first a little bit about demand. So interest in the flexible workspace industry currently sits above pre-pandemic levels across many markets. And in fact, demand in some of the European markets is actually outpacing the global average. The graph that you can currently see on screen represents the change that we've seen on our online platform since the very start of the pandemic. And it's probably unsurprising that towards the end of the first quarter last year, that demand plummeted as much of the world was thrown into lockdown and offices were emptied. But that interest, interestingly, did rebound almost as quickly as it dropped. And in fact, currently, we're seeing global levels of demand around 40% higher than before we went into the pandemic. The flexible workspace industry in Spain has traditionally been a few steps behind some of the other European markets. But I think what is positive to take from this is that even over the past 12 months, that interest within FlexSpace in Spain is on a general upward trajectory. And in fact, at the beginning of last month, levels of demand were around 30% higher than before we went into the pandemic. And we fully expect this trend is going to continue as we move into the rest of 2021 and beyond. Just to put that into a little bit of perspective, if we look at the Asia Pacific market, which are slightly ahead of the curve because they were some of the first countries to be plunged into lockdown and are now starting to see more recovery, the levels of demand there are very much higher than when they went into the pandemic. And our colleagues in Singapore are reporting a much greater level of normality there. People are starting to return to the office. The team there actually went out for their first team meal in a restaurant for the first time in a year last week. So they're very much getting back to normal. And you know, Europe's probably around 6 months behind where they are in Asia Pacific, but I do still think it's very positive to see that they are returning to the office, they are starting to get back to normal, and we'll very much get to that position in the coming months. So just looking now at supply of flex space across Europe. Well, if we take the European flex market as a whole, the number of flexible workspace locations actually grew by 3% throughout 2020, despite it being such a disruptive year. This is actually opposite to what we've seen in markets such as the UK and Asia Pacific, where we actually saw supply decrease for the first time in a number of years by about 1 to 2% during the past year. The UK remains the flex capital of Europe. It's long been home to the lion's share of the flexible workspace industry, which is then followed by France, Germany, and Spain currently enjoys the 4th largest market within Europe. And many European companies have in fact continued to grow throughout the pandemic, albeit at a much slower rate than they were as we went into the pandemic. just taking France for an example, France was growing at a phenomenal rate of around 20% in supply in 2019 before the pandemic hit. And the Netherlands has seen some of the largest growth across Europe in the past year, with about 6% growth between 2019 and 2020, which is largely in response to a huge upsurge in demand that they were seeing just as they went into the pandemic, and indeed during the earlier part of last year. However, the surge in supply that we saw just as we went into the pandemic has had a negative impact on rates. So if we take a look now just at the change in rates over the past year, you can see that the high supply growth within France has resulted in Paris having some of the largest reductions in workstation rates that we've seen across Europe. This increased supply and then dramatically falling demand did cause operators to slash workstation rates, which is something that we'd never seen before the pandemic. This has made this very much a buyer's market. And so FlexSpace operators are having to react to the change in market, and they can react much quicker than their traditional counterparts, which means that FlexSpace operators can change rates very quickly, depending on what they're seeing in the market. But that's not true across the board. Some markets are certainly bucking this trend. Berlin, for example, was a very strong market as we went into the pandemic. It had very strong demand, and so rates were high, and they remained high during the first quarter of last year before they slowly started to decline, resulting in about 1% increase overall. Similarly, in Barcelona, we've seen demand remain relatively buoyant in that market, which is helping to keep rates above around 400 euros per workstation. But this has been helped by several larger corporate deals that we've seen in that market over the past 12 months. I think it's fair to say that it's by no means a consistent picture across the board, but this general downward trend in rates that we are seeing is very much to the benefit of the occupier. So I just wanted to take a look here a little bit about the expectations within the industry and the reality that we're actually seeing play out. Over the past year, we've often heard terms such as de-densification, huge discounts, buyer's market, both from those within and outside of the industry. This has not really been helped by the fact that the media is often talking about the fact that the office is dead. However, from my perspective at least, this perception that many have of the flexible workspace industry isn't actually what we are seeing in reality in the market. Let's look at de-densification, for example. Office densities, as far as we've seen, have remained relatively stable throughout the pandemic. Operators are not allowing extra square meters per desk because this wouldn't really be financially viable for them. Instead, what we're seeing is that they're temporarily closing off workstations, they're closing down some of the shared areas in order to protect the well-being of staff without actually affecting the long-term density levels within the industry. Similarly, huge discounts. Yes, we are seeing decrease in rates, but it's not by any means in every market and in every situation. We have seen declines across the major cities over the past 6 months, but in fact, some of the smaller suburban locations are actually reporting an increase of rates remaining stable in those markets because they've actually seen an uptick in demand there. In general, our feedback from operators has been that they are offering discounts on a case-by-case basis, and we have seen extremes of up to 50% off for 6 months, but it's by no means across the board. Probably one of the most interesting and unique pieces of information that we've actually been able to look at during this pandemic is the contractual occupancy levels within the UK. And our data shows that rates have dropped in occupancy, but it's by no means been as much as what we would have expected as we went into the pandemic. It's actually been by about 10 percentage points on average across the UK. And similarly as with rates, some of the out-of-town operators have actually reported rate their occupancy rates remaining stable or increasing throughout the pandemic, because a lot of occupiers who wanted to avoid traveling on public transport have actually been able to just drive to the out of town locations, so their occupancy has remained relatively stable. This is just a representation of what we've seen across the UK, but I think it's probably reasonable to believe that it is representative across many markets. And I think what the key takeaway from this is that the anticipated collapse in occupancy across flexible workspaces, hasn't completely panned out as we would have expected. It's by no means been as bad as we thought. We know we're not completely out of the woods yet, but we do think that this occupancy will now start taking an upward turn as workers do start to return to the office in the coming months. So let's just have a look now at how Spain compares to the other markets within Europe. So in terms of supply of flex space within Spain has long been centered around Madrid and Barcelona. The high saturation of international clients within these markets is certainly driving demand and supply in these cities. However, what we have seen is that the market share held by these two cities is actually declining as secondary cities are growing in popularity. Supply is overall more diverse in Spain than what we see in some other European countries, which actually provides the occupier a lot more choice. IWG are expanding across Spain through their Spaces brand, but their market share has declined from around 8% in 2019 to around 6% this year. So this shift is then enabling more local brands to take to the stage. And we're actually seeing a lot of the new supply coming from existing local operators who are perhaps moving into new markets. For example, just as one example, the Barcelona-based operator Monday are now moving into Madrid for the first time. The larger than average portion of independent players within Spain, as I've said, does give more choice to the occupier than other European markets, which are very much dominated by the big players. And in other countries, what we're seeing is that the flexible workspace landscape is changing, and we are getting more choice from other companies who are now looking to move towards flex space leasing. For example, in the UK and the US, we've seen this through a number of options. For example, self-delivery such as Tishman Speyer's FlexArm Studio, and also partnerships such as Heinz partnership with Industrious. In Spain, there's similar examples such as the traditional landlord Colonial, who are well established in the flex market through Utopicus, but we are likely to see more traditional landlords incorporating flex space into their spaces as flex space becomes more and more popular. But this increased choice in the market is going to mean that the operators are going to have to step up. They're going to have to offer more to attract their clients and offer unique and individual amenities and an experience to the occupier so that they don't get left behind and so that they can stand out in what's going to become a crowded market. So let's look at what's driving the high demand in some of these locations. Well, there's a huge amount of UK employees and those from other European cities who are now able to work from home full-time, and they're moving to the coastal towns of Palma, Valencia, Malaga, which is really driving up demand in these locations. I mean, there's good weather, sunshine, beautiful coastline. Who wouldn't want to work on the beach if you could work from anywhere? But the challenge in these markets is going to be that supply is much smaller in these markets than what we've seen in other cities. Palma de Mallorca, for example, is currently home to just 4% of the total flex space that we have within Spain. And so this increased demand is soon going to outstrip supply. So what we're going to need is more investment in these secondary markets in order for there to be sufficient supply to service the increased demand. Another hurdle that we might see is that if it's international companies initially who are moving to these secondary markets, they're going to expect a level of fit out and a level of service, which perhaps isn't in abundance in these markets currently. So there's going to need to be further investment there to supply A-class, high-end operators who can service those companies. We have seen, as I've mentioned before, demand within Barcelona remain buoyant. We've seen quite a high demand for the area known as Act 22, 29 Arroba, excuse my pronunciation there, because we've seen a lot of tech companies moving into this area, and that's attracting further companies to that area. Although it is still close to the center of Barcelona, it is attracting companies further out of the city. And we've seen this as well in Madrid. Madrid Rio is also becoming increasingly popular because Google is based there, so other companies want to be based close to them. And so I think what we're seeing here is that if the demand drivers change, so can the demand be pulled outside of cities. If larger international companies start basing themselves elsewhere, we're going to see a lot of smaller companies who support those companies and work closely with them follow suit. I think what we are seeing that's of interest within Spain is the average workstation requirement size is relatively high compared to other European markets. And we've had a lot of interest and transactions with larger corporate companies within Spain over this past year. And this is very much a trend that we expect to see grow and spread across many other markets in the coming months, because larger companies are looking to inject more flexibility and more agility into their workspace portfolios. And this is exactly where Flex can help them. So I just wanted to look here a little bit about pricing in terms of primary and secondary cities, as we've been talking about that recently. As we went into the pandemic, the gap between workstation rates in primary cities compared to those in secondary cities was starting to close. The higher demand that we were starting to see in secondary cities, coupled with the lower levels of supply in those markets, was starting to push rates up in those areas. However, the pandemic has slightly started to reverse that trend, and we've seen this gap widen again. But I think that's probably just going to be a short-term reaction to the current climate rather than a longer-term trend. A couple of reasons for this. One, international operators are able to offer hugely discounted rates, such as half price for up to 6 months, which is forcing the smaller operators to follow suit. And secondly, we've seen average rates in some of the primary cities boosted by a few larger transactions with corporate clients that we've seen within those markets over this past year. So I think we will start to see that gap start to close again as we move out of the pandemic. But what is interesting is that this gap between the primary and secondary cities isn't as pronounced in Spain as what we do see across some other European countries. If we take the UK, France, for example, rates in cities outside of the city centre can be up to around €400 more for a flex space within the capital, London or Paris, compared to the smaller cities on the outskirts. And as we move forward, we do expect secondary cities within Spain and within other markets to gain in popularity as companies start to try and disperse their portfolio and provide working options closer to home where people live. Which leads me on to just talk about the general workspace trends that we've seen emerged over this past year from conversations we've been having with a lot of our clients. And a key question that's being asked of businesses today is, can your workspace keep up with your people? I think we've all experienced remote working over the past year, but it's been very different experience for many different people, depending on circumstances. Some people love working from home, some people can't wait to get back to the office. You know, it's very different. But I think one thing we're all sure of is that the way that we do work has changed for good. So what does this actually mean for the future of the workplace? Well, personally, I would say that the workspace is currently at a tipping point, and there's a lot of factors that we need to take into account and think through in order to create this ideal office for the future. Since the start of the pandemic, we've spoken to around 400 operators globally, probably more, in order to try and understand what the top drivers are for their occupiers And it came out that the top priority is indeed flexibility. Secondly, the way that occupiers actually view their space has changed. As we've mentioned earlier, it's no longer just a place to go to work. What they actually want to get is an experience. It needs to be a space that offers a service and a unique experience to actually bring workers back into the office. The workforce have now realized that they don't need to be tied to a specific workplace anymore, but what they actually want is the flexibility to choose to work where they're most productive, be that at home, be that from a local co-working hub, or within the core office itself. And this change is going to take place when we have the CRE professionals, IT and HR teams working together in order to create a workplace that can adapt and that can change to its occupier. I think this is going to be achieved in a number of ways. First, the physical workplace, that's going to need to be redesigned. It will need to promote collaboration with increased communal areas, increased meeting rooms, because it's that collaboration that people have really missed from working from home. Secondly, the IT teams, they're going to need to ensure that there's IT infrastructure in place to support both those working at home and those working within the office at the same time. Thirdly, the HR factor, they need to ensure that this new portfolio mirrors and enhances company culture, and that it also ensures the well-being of staff. And I believe that when all of these three factors combine, the result is going to be a real estate portfolio that can adapt as a business evolves and to ensure that that business doesn't get left behind. Here, I just wanted to touch very briefly on some of the things that our operators are doing in order to attract their occupiers back into the office, with, I think, an overwhelming main focus on health and safety and putting in place measures that do ensure that staff feel safe within their environment as they return to work. Taking, for example, again, Asia Pacific, where we've already seen occupiers return. What operators there are telling us is that there's a huge importance on well-being and wellness within their offices in order to ensure that their people do want to return and that they feel safe and happy to do so. This kind of follows a general trend that we're seeing, which is the shift towards the importance of people rather than property in this new working way that we'll have as we evolve from the pandemic. It's going to be very, very important to put staff to the forefront, which is something that probably wasn't always a priority for businesses beforehand. Some of the examples of measures being used currently across the industry are temperature checks on arrival, increased cleaning, improved HVAC systems to ensure that there's fresh air within the offices, and additional signage and one-way systems. But there's many, many more things that operators are putting in place to ensure the safety of their staff and occupiers. I think all of these factors together will hopefully encourage workers back into the office over the coming months. But what will this new office look like when workers do start to return to the office? I think as a result of the change in purpose of the office, of what occupiers are demanding from their office, this is going to result in an evolution of new workplace strategies that companies are going to start to implement in the coming months. So here we've just compared the change in sentiment of occupiers pre-pandemic and then in the early stages of the pandemic last year. And the way that occupiers viewed flexible workspace was very different. During the early stage of the pandemic, we went through a shift from a position where over 60% of businesses didn't expect more than 10% of their portfolios to be within flexible workspace, to just 3 months later, almost every company we spoke to saw flexible workspace as being a vital part of their future portfolio. And now that we've all had a bit more time to experience the impacts of the pandemic, we are now starting to see companies looking to understand what their options are and looking to want to test out new models to see what's best going to suit their business. So while we're pretty certain that the way we work is going to change, there isn't one fixed solution to that problem. We've spoken to several heads of business over the past year, and their return to work strategies do vary quite significantly, from those who are going to make the home the premium workplace for all of their employees going forward, to those that are going to combine a central office that's then supported by local co-working hubs and home working options. What the real future portfolio is going to look like is very hard to predict. But from a lot of the conversations we've had, we're currently predicting that where we currently see around 90% of headcount within the core hub office and then only around 10% working flexibly, this is going to shift to probably around a third of the users within the core office, and then the majority of the workforce actually using a combination of local co-working solutions or working from home. But what we don't expect is just a like-for-like cost reduction with this, because although the core office footprint will reduce, we do expect to see businesses invest more heavily in this core office in order to make it a place that staff want to go to and that they want to use for certain activities. There will indeed be cost savings to be made if you move a part of your portfolio into flexible workspace, especially if this is then spread over several secondary locations, which are more cost effective. There will be cost savings to be made. But what we are going to see, I think, in the coming months is a period of testing, measuring, learning and adapting in order to find the portfolio that's going to best suit each individual business. And that can be a very expensive proposition if you're talking about using traditional space. And that's another reason why we expect to see a continued increase in interest for flexible space, because that offers the ideal way to test these various scenarios out for your business without huge amounts of initial capital outlay and long-term leases. So the key for businesses is going to be adapting. Many businesses are going to look to move all or even a portion of their real estate into flexible workspace in order to be able to get this agility and flexibility that they're looking for. But what are the benefits of this strategy? Well, there's many positive outcomes for both the individual and for the business. I think many of us have experienced shorter commute times over the past year and a better work-life balance as a result while we've been working from home. On average, I would say around each individual has probably saved around 1.5 hours a day commuting, which actually equates to around 33 working days throughout the year. Now that's a lot of time to give up if your employer asks you to go back into the office full time. So by adopting this new flexible working model, this will help businesses to improve their staff retention, but it will also help them to attract staff who are looking for that level of flexibility, which they perhaps can't get with their current employer. By reducing the need to be in the office every day, this is also going to widen the talent pool for many companies, because they'll be able to attract staff who are based further afield, who then don't need to commute into the office every day. And it pretty much opens almost the world up to companies in order to attract their talent, because if they can work from home, they can be working from anywhere. So just one of the solutions that we've been looking at in terms of new workspace models is what we call the dispersed portfolio, or the hub and spoke model. This is where you have one central office, which is then supported by several suburban hubs, local flex space operators, and home working. And if we look at comparing the demand that we've received from 2019 to 2020, there is a definite trend emerging, which is that a greater proportion of demand is going to these secondary locations outside of the key cities in many markets. Although this shift isn't as pronounced in Spain as it is in other European markets, we did see around 20% more of demand going to cities outside of the core markets over the past year, which suggests that there definitely is an appetite growing for this type of model. It's not going to be without its challenges, though. In Spain, which is similar to other markets such as Latin America and Asia, the working culture doesn't necessarily lend itself ideally to this type of model. Presenteeism and the need for employers to actually physically see their workers within the office is very high in these cultures, which means that this model might well initially be adopted more by larger international companies based there, at least in the short term, while more local companies start to rethink their model and will slowly adopt this new agile working model. I think it is going to happen. It's just going to take a little bit longer, and this actually will give supply in these secondary markets time to catch up. So lastly, what I just wanted to share with you is some of the thought leadership that we have gathered from our Agile Corporate Real Estate think tank. We established it in March last year with the aim of understanding what other heads of real estate are thinking, and also to share strategies and best practices across a number of industries. So we've spoken to around 60 heads of real estate over the past year, and that's growing all the time as we're continuing to do more and more interviews with heads of real estate. And we're starting to try and get a picture of what the future of real estate is going to look like. And the one element that most respondents agreed on is the fact that the future portfolio is going to be very different to what we see today, and it's going to have a much more agile approach. As a result of this agile approach, what we're going to see is that our approach to workspace, as well as the evaluation of workspace, is going to change. And there's going to be much more focus on workplace design and purpose, as well as on the people who occupy it. We're very much seeing this move from property to people, and it's the people that are going to be at the fore in real estate making decisions going forward, as opposed to just the property itself. This new corporate real estate role, it was believed, is going to bring HR, real estate and technology together, as I've mentioned previously, which is then going to create this new working model, a new office, which is going to be adapt and keep up with changing business needs. So just to sum up, I think the key to everything I've been speaking about is the ability to adapt and change. And as Charles Darwin said when speaking about evolution, it's the one which is the most responsive to change that will be the one that survives. This can easily be related to real estate, because in order to keep up with the ever-changing needs of the people, with the business, the office needs to be able to adapt at the same speed. And this new focus on the agility of real estate, which has been highlighted over the past year by the pandemic, has brought to light the fact that it is flexible workspaces which are the most adapted to the change, and who can change quickly. They can change size, rates. They're able to react very quickly to changing market conditions, and it's therefore flexible workspaces which is going to be the ones to survive and prosper as we go into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. The research was excellent. Great. Thank you very much. I have one question for you.
Yeah.
One of your first slides, you said the interest in flex office just bumped up after the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And we also saw that in Spain. But what is about the conversion? A lot of people is interested more in flexible space, in co-working spaces. But as a broker, you see the conversion and the close or the sign a contract it's linked with this interest, or it's not that we are not closing that much?
I think we have certainly over the past few months, definitely through the early part of this year, we're certainly seeing the transactions increase as well. A lot of the interest that we are receiving, people are looking for a few months down the line and into the future. But I think particularly within the larger companies, as I mentioned, we've had a lot of interest from corporate companies. They're certainly transacting a lot more now than what they did pre-pandemic. We've closed quite a few deals with larger companies looking for larger amounts of space within Flex, which is definitely a very positive sign. But we have absolutely, I think towards the latter part of last year, there was still that gap between the kind of interest and the transactions, but we are starting to see that slows. And this year, I've certainly had feedback from a lot of our sales teams recently that interest and that transactions is now growing as people are starting to move back into the office and starting to kind of plan the future of their business.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your answer. I have a question, and maybe it's a little tricky. You said that in the process, it's HR involved, IT involved, and also the real estate environment of the company. But when talking with huge companies, sometimes they say that at the end, there's more weight on one side or the other. Which one of those three areas do you think is holding the bucket or at least taking the decisions?
Well, it's a tricky one. I think, to be honest, there's probably no set answer. I think it's going to be very much a case-by-case basis on different companies and where they place their importance. I think for us, what the ideal is that all three work together if they want to create this ideal office of the future, because it's all three elements that need to work and need to succeed in order to be able to have a fully flexible, agile approach. But as I've said, some of the companies we've spoken to, some are going from having every employee working from home to some which are having more the core office, but then just supported by some more remote working. So depending on which approach they're going for, I think that is going to then sway which is going to have the final decision within that company. And those that are going for a more remote working, agile approach will have to ensure that, I think HR is very, very much involved, because you need to keep that company culture. I think that's something that we've all felt from working from home, is that interaction with colleagues and also just the training for new starters, new employees, that needs to absolutely be there for the business to succeed. But then you can't do that agile approach if you don't have the technology there. So it's all very much intertwined. And I think that the level of flexibility that the company is going to offer is then going to probably determine which of those elements is going to get the final say.
Thank you so much.
I want to say, if you want the presentation of Sarah Colwell, you have in the app, you can download in the app, just down, okay? Just scroll a bit down and you have the presentation available. This is the turn. I want to appreciate your presentation here, your time. Thank you very much to being here, and thank you for your time. Thank you to Instant Group and what's a wonderful research. And this time for questions. And so if we have any question from our audience, this is the time to do it. Okay. So thank you very much, and it's time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hola a todos. Hola, Marc.
Buenos días.
Si quieres, puedes empezar con las preguntas, Marc.
Hi, thanks, Sarah, for your presentation. We have one question from Victor from Seville, and the question reads: thank you for your focus on secondary markets. I have seen that Sevilla is one of the most affected by the pandemic. I would like to know if you have more information about this, and it's based on the results of major operators or also independent operators. Have you seen differences on the occupation by freelancers and independent occupiers and corporate client teams? Thank you very much. It has been very interesting. Okay. So I think the question goes in two ways. It's like one, more info about the Seville, and then on the other hand, it's where did you get the info? So which are the sources for the reports that you are doing or the presentation you did? And also on the other hand, the third part, it will be difference between freelancers and like co-working traditional kind of client versus the corporate teams?
Yes. Well, hold on. Let me introduce Pablo. I forgot about, so let me introduce Pablo Choa, that is a partner of Sarah Colwell and is based on Spain. So maybe the question is for both of you. Okay. So if you think Pablo is the best person to answer, just go ahead. If it's Sarah, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Let me start. Yeah. Let me start by saying that, yeah, as Sarah mentioned, we've seen high demand in secondary markets, and a good example, as you mentioned before, is the city of Sevilla, which due to many reasons, such as, for example, like good weather is always an important factor for international companies. Also, the fact that obviously renting an office there, it's more cost effective than in other cities such as Madrid and Barcelona. We've seen a high increase in terms of the demand. Also, regarding what Mark mentioned about some other, let's say, freelancers or smaller companies, also the southern coast of Spain, such as Malaga and Marbella, has been very attractive. We've received many inquiries from freelancers from all over, like Central and Northern Europe, that they want to spend a few, they want to work, instead of working from home in the cold and gray countries of Northern Europe, they want to spend it in the southern coast of Spain. And then regarding the data that we have and that we've gathered, probably Sarah can talk about this a bit more and elaborate a bit more, but obviously it has been gathered and collected through the many deals and that we've made in the past and in the last year as well, that, as Sarah mentioned, as everybody knows, that there haven't been as many transactions as before, but also has given us enough information to come up with all this data.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I think just in general, in terms of looking at kind of the balance between freelancers and corporate clients, I've done a bit of analysis recently, kind of more looking at global markets. But I think what we are seeing is the kind of gap, whereas traditionally we saw quite a large proportion of our demand coming from the kind of 1 to 2 inquiries. We are seeing that slightly shift now, and we've seen the portion of kind of larger requirements of kind of 10 plus people, even 25 plus people looking at flex is definitely growing. So we are seeing that balance kind of coming back towards more equal between smaller companies and corporate companies as well, which traditionally we always saw a much larger proportion of our demand from the kind of smaller independents, let's say 1 to 2 person requirements. And in terms of our data, as Pablo mentioned, we gather a lot of it through our online platform, where we receive lots of inquiries through our transactions. So a lot of it is all our own data. And we've also been working on our corporate real estate think tank over the past year, where we've been speaking a lot to heads of real estate to try and gather more kind of thought leadership in terms of not just the transactions, but also what a company is looking to do in the future, what's their portfolio going to look like, so that we can try and gather that insight and then share it among our corporate clients, so that they can see what other people are doing within the similar industries and try to get a feel for how the office is going to evolve in the future.
Thanks for that very long and very detailed answer. I know that every single time it's the same. People, it's slow in starting asking question, but we have the following one from Ben Kolb from Malaga. Thanks for the very thorough research, Sarah. Is there any data you can share on digital nomads concretely? For example, any data that indicates digital nomads are starting to move more again and request flexible office solutions in the countries they visit?
Yes, as I was mentioning, we can look, I mean, we certainly can have a look at our data in terms of the kind of smaller requirements that we are receiving for kind of 1 to 2 people. And also in terms of our source, we often look at industry type and see where those requirements are coming from. So we can do some analysis on whether they are freelancers. I know our market report for Asia Pacific is coming out shortly, and for that we did look at the types of industry, and we certainly saw a huge increase in the kind of self-employed industries coming through, looking at flex space for that. So we are definitely seeing that trend. I don't know, Pablo, if within Spain specifically you've noticed any trends in that respect.
Yeah, for example, cities like maybe Palma de Mallorca or Valencia or Alicante that maybe before we didn't receive many leads or many requests for those cities. Now they're becoming more and more popular, especially for digital nomads, as you've just mentioned, and international clients that they are willing to spend time, let's say, in better weather than in Central and Northern Europe.
Okay, I have a question. Do you think in the race for the mid city, in the race for the mid city lead between Valencia, Alicante, Seville, Valencia, in your opinion, which city is winning the race?
For me, I would say Malaga, Marbella, kind of like Malaga, Marbella, is becoming more and more popular, especially amongst Russian and Scandinavian clients. They are willing to spend, because also some of them, they have their second homes there. So for them, it's quite easy to move there and spend some time, maybe a couple of months, maybe up to 6 months, depending on their needs and depending on what they especially what their industry is. But I would say that, yeah, maybe Malaga / Marbella would be the winner out of all these cities.
Okay, good question. Sarah's not saying nothing. Okay. Okay, second question was, Spain has more independent players or strong local or local brands, right? So, and this is a challenge for the big brands. Why do you think this market is different from other markets in the sense?
I think I'll give my view and then you can agree or disagree, Pablo. But I think it's probably it's quite dispersed in Spain. I think perhaps the cities are not as large as some of the ones that we've seen, secondary cities that we see in other markets where the big players have already moved into those locations because the demand is already there. They're probably a few steps ahead of perhaps where Spain is. So those big players have not moved into those locations within Spain. So it's the kind of more local players who are starting, almost got the ahead of the game there in terms of actually kind of moving into secondary markets and getting that demand. But I'm sure that as we do see the demand in secondary cities increase, which we are starting to see, that we probably will start to see then those larger players diverse more across Spain into different markets.
Yes, I think this is a movement that maybe maybe we are going to ask in next session to the Spanish market, Spanish players.
I think a good example to compare to, for example, would be the German market. For example, like in Germany, they don't have, because in Spain it's Madrid and Barcelona, okay, the main cities. But in Germany, they have so many important cities, such as, for example, like Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, Hamburg. So it's more diverse, the market. And all the big operators are in every single city. It is true that in Spain, cover all the smaller cities is not as easy, but for example, operators such as IWG are starting to pay more and more attention to these secondary markets, and hopefully some other larger operators will follow and will start having centers over there.
Okay, so don't miss the next session, the War of Co-working, the Co-working War. We are going to have on Tuesday with IWG, Loom, and Utopicus. So we are going to try to talk about this. So Mark, next question. We have two of them.
Yeah, it's today they are shy, so I'm going to make the last question to close this session.
You got two, right?
No, I got only one. I think this one is good enough to talk a bit about the subject. And this is a question that maybe Sarah can reply, but for sure Pablo can reply. We have seen in the data you presented that flexibility is the one on top with the main concern of current tenants. And I'm wondering how big festival spaces like EWG, WeWork, and these kind of international companies are tackling flexibility in comparison with local brands or smaller spaces. And I said that Pablo for sure will have a lot of info because he's dealing with these kind of leads every single day. And yes, as Manu mentioned, next Wednesday and next Tuesday, sorry, we'll have the co-working Cold War, which is exploring this undercover war, price war, which may or may not exist. So I would like to have your point of view on this subject.
Sarah, you wanna answer, or do you want me to
Oh,
go?
that's not fair, Pablo. That's not fair. You give Sarah the tough answer
No, I
first.
mean,
Come on.
I'll let you go,
no.
Pablo. Go
Okay,
on.
no. It's okay. As we mentioned, like the big operators such as IWG and WeWork, they are kind of like more flexible when it comes to offering big discounts, and it is something that maybe before smaller players or smaller operators couldn't afford to do, but now they've realized that if they want to compete with these bigger operators and with the big players, they have also to be able to provide those discounts. As we mentioned, and as Charles Darwin mentioned, you have to adapt in order to be able to compete with the other players in the market. You have to adapt. And sometimes you have to copy the other strategies that other players are doing. So that is basically what we're doing. I remember previously with some operators were kind of like a bit reluctant to negotiate and to bring down prices, because at the end of the day they have to get margins and make a profit. Obviously, that's the main point of the business. But now they are more and more willing to say, okay, Pablo, let's negotiate. Let's get if getting a better price is going to be that it will make the decision maker say, okay, I'm going with this smaller player. We'll be more than happy to do so in order to compete with these big players.
Before Sarah, I will ask an extra question to you. Some operators said that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was huge discounts, and it seems that right now there are not huge discounts. But by your words, I think that you're saying just the opposite. That at the beginning there was not so common to make those discounts, and right now it's more common. Can you develop a little bit
Also,
more?
it's kind of like a case by case situation, because obviously if you are in the middle of conversations with a client and the sales process is quite advanced already and it's quite close to getting the signature and to get the deal done, but if the matter is a few euros here and there, obviously they're willing to negotiate and to bring down the price a little bit. It is also true that since operators are receiving more and more leads and the demand is picking up again, so that it seems like they don't need to make those bigger discounts that they were doing kind of like 4, 5, 6 months ago. So now it seems like things are getting kind of like back to normal, or we kind of see that the back to normality will be kind of like maybe after summer, maybe it depends, but it is true that they don't need to rely on these massive discounts as they used to do. But obviously there's still, you know, Mark, and you perfectly know that there's always room for negotiation there.
I think they're not
Absolutely.
advertising them as much as they were initially. Like, you know, the workstation rates on, you know, websites and things, they're kind of going back more to normal. They don't want to advertise it to bring all the rates down, but, you know, certainly they are negotiating, you know, in some instances to try and, I think, get the clients in. But I do think that it will get to the point where, you know, if everyone's offering reduced rates, it's going to get to a point where price is not the main factor anymore. Obviously, it is important for a lot of companies in this time who have been affected by the pandemic, but it's going to be, as we've talked about, much more about what amenities they can offer and what experience they can give. That's going to become more important as well to clients as they get back into the office, rather than just price alone. I think it's going to, we talk about the price war, but I think it will get to the point where it's much more than just the price and the lowest price that they can offer. It's what they can actually offer to the experience of the user who's going to be in the office, which is going to be more important to them.
Thank you for that reply. I think that that's really important for local operators because they have much more flexibility to adapt and to start offering this more tailored service, more more amenities, and be closer to the client at the end. And every single time it happens the same thing. It's like it's difficult for Spaniards to warm up and ask questions. We have 3 now, so let's do it. Let's do it in a fast way. We don't want to be to have a really long session. So Ana Berta Mereyes asks, congratulations, Sarah. My question is, how do you make a great portfolio for a city like Santiago de Compostela? That's a tough one.
I might have to pass that on to Pablo, I think.
Well done. Well done. I approve that.
Well, it is true that Santiago de Compostela is not this. To be honest with you, I don't think I've worked any leads recently in Santiago de Compostela. Obviously, it's difficult to create a great portfolio, but I would say that maybe starting with smaller, kind of like smaller offices, but by smaller offices, obviously the big players are not going to say, okay, we are opening a new center in Santiago de Compostela tomorrow. But I think with time and maybe in 2-3 years time, if there's kind of like an organic growth within the market, I think it would be a possibility to have a few centers and to have like a competitive serviced office industry over there in Santiago de Compostela.
Thank you, Pablo. I have another question from John Vives. Said, do you think that the demand in big city centers like Barcelona is going to change to a collaboration hub workspace layout? I don't know what he understands for that. I think that it's an open space.
I assume that the hub model that we've seen in other countries is kind of like having a main office and then have some other satellite.
But that's the hub and spoke model, right?
Yes.
Perhaps it's that the layout, if it's talking about the layout of perhaps the offices and co-working spaces is changing. Certainly from a lot of the feedback we've had from clients we've spoken to recently, that they see the office as much more of a collaboration space. So although during the pandemic, I think we kind of went the opposite way and people wanted their own individual office, not near to lots of people, a lot of the open spaces were closed down. You know, the purpose of the office going forward is going to be much more around collaboration. So we will probably see, and this is where kind of flex spaces are ideally positioned, because they can change their layout relatively easily in terms of having this co-working space, but having it more socially distanced initially, and then as rules change, you know, it can be adapted as we go forward. But I definitely think there will be a greater need for collaboration space within offices post-pandemic, because that's going to be very much the purpose of the office and what we've all missed from being within an office space.
Okay, I ask in the chat. Maybe Joan can give a further explanations about what he meant. So I think that we replied to him, but in case Joan, if you're listening to me, you can text, you can type on the chat. And the last one is from Mentol. Do you have any data on companies and corporates requesting offers for the team retreats in co-living spaces?
We don't generally have a lot of data on co-living. It's not something that we kind of analyze, but I think there probably will be more maybe of a collaboration between co-working and co-living going forward, particularly if we see a lot of people who can work from home, work from anywhere, are going to go to these lovely remote destinations on the beach in an island somewhere in the sunshine. Then, you know, co-working and co-living spaces then together would actually be ideal, because it gives you that space to live and space to work for, you know, however long you want to be there. If you're going to travel the world and work remotely, you know, co-living and co-working then would be the ideal solution. So I think it's definitely something, you know, from my view at least, we will probably see, but at the moment we don't really look at co-living space specifically.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. Joan meant the hub and spoke model. So I think we are good to go. And there's one question identified. I don't know who made the question because Manu sent to me. Said, we have seen more early requests, people asking for office space starting from 3-4 months later. Have you experienced it too?
Yes, definitely. It is true that maybe before, kind of like the whole sales cycle used to take maybe like 1 or 2 months. Now we are seeing like from 4 to 6 months, and even as Sarah mentioned before, lots of big corporate clients are kind of like benchmarking to explore what the market look like, let's say after summer or even early in 2022. So it is true that it is not as, okay, I need an office by tomorrow, or it's like, okay, I'm starting to plan ahead of September or ahead of early next year. So please, can I get some prices? Can I get some information? And the overall process, it's taking way longer than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. We have another one. Will we need to support the same kind of work of right now with the discounts and the safety and other models for many years, or do you think it will change in a few years? Okay, so I think that it means that if you think that the health measures, distance, etc., will be here to stay for a long time or not.
I think it will be here in the short term, but personally, I think we will get to the stage where we kind of are getting back to normal, and offices will become as they were previously. I think it will be more even when we're all vaccinated, when everything is kind of fine. It will still be in the mentality of some people to, I think, keep the distance and until we get over that for a few months at least. But I think if we're talking about kind of in years in the future, then I think that that health and safety and the social distance probably will diminish eventually, and we will get back to the more collaborating spaces, particularly if we're talking about the office being a more focus on collaboration. I think that will definitely draw people back together, and will overcome that the kind of mentality that we will have for a while of keeping our distance from people.
I hope so. I think that everybody is really eager for that moment to arrive. By the way, the question about the 3-4 months later increasing leads was from Vivian from the Valley, and this one is from Imagalia. Well, I think that we can end the panel. Sorry, the session. Manu, what do you think?
Yes, that's right. I want to appreciate your presence here, Sarah and Pablo from the Instant Group. Thank you for being here. You have the presentation. You can download the presentation using the app, or we already put the link on the chat or an attentive hour in Zoom, so you can download it. So thank you very much. So we'll see you next Tuesday with the Cold War of Coworking, or La Guerra Fría del Coworking, with Paula Almanza de Loom, Aurea Rivela de Utopicus y Philip Jiménez de Spaces, de Rebus, de IWG. Así que muchas gracias, damos por terminado el panel de hoy y nada, nos vemos en la próxima. Gracias a todos. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Pablo.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.